What if the person you just tried to destroy had the power to erase you instead? Richard Vaughn is a man who never hears no. His money, his influence, they shape the world around him. So when he sees a woman in first class who, in his eyes, doesn't belong, he doesn't ask questions. He demands her removal. No hesitation, no consequences. Because who's going to stop him? But what if the person he tried to humiliate held more power than he could ever imagine? What begins as an act of arrogance spirals into a nightmare Richard never saw coming. A battle of influence, a reckoning, a fall so catastrophic that by the time this flight lands, he won't just lose his seat, he'll lose everything. Do you think a man like Richard deserves what's coming? Tell us in the comments. And let us know, where are you watching from today? If you love stories of downfall, karma, and shocking twists, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what happens next. What if the person you just humiliated held the power to destroy everything you built? What if, in your arrogance, you dismissed someone so important that your downfall became inevitable? Richard Vaughn had no idea that today would mark the beginning of his end. The air inside the first-class cabin hummed with quiet luxury. The soft clink of glasses, the muted rustle of newspapers, and the occasional murmur of polite conversation. It was an environment Richard thrived in, a kingdom of exclusivity where he belonged and others didn't. That's why, the moment his gaze landed on the woman sitting next to him, his mood soured. She was black, dressed simply, with a quiet elegance that did nothing to announce wealth or status. She didn't belong here, not in his world. Richard's lip curled in disdain. He turned to the nearest flight attendant, a blonde woman in her early 30s who was already moving toward him with a practiced smile. "Is there a problem, Mr. Vaughn?" she asked, her voice smooth, attentive. "Yes." Richard gestured at the woman beside him without looking at her. "She's in the wrong seat." The attendant blinked, glancing at the woman. She had yet to say a word, but her gaze was steady, observing, waiting. "Sir, if I could just check." "No need," Richard cut her off. "Just handle it. This is first class, not a charity event." The words were sharp, deliberate. A few passengers within earshot exchanged glances, but none spoke up. They never did. The flight attendant hesitated only a second before nodding. "I'll take care of it." Turning to the woman, she forced a polite smile. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" The woman remained still. Then, slowly, she reached into her bag, pulled out a neatly folded ticket, and handed it over. The attendant unfolded it, eyes flicking across the details. Her smile faltered. "This is correct," she murmured. Richard scoffed. "That can't be right." "Sir, her seat is. Then it must have been upgraded by mistake," he snapped. "She clearly doesn't belong here." Finally, the woman spoke. Her voice was calm, steady. "And why is that, Mr. Vaughn?" There was no accusation in her tone, no emotion at all. It was a question, simple and direct. Richard turned to her, for the first time, eyes narrowing. "Because I know people like you don't pay for seats like this." A flicker of something unreadable passed through her gaze. She didn't flinch, didn't react the way most would. Instead, she simply took back her ticket as the attendant handed it over, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Vaughn," the attendant said carefully, "her seat is confirmed." "There's nothing to." Richard waved her off. "I don't care. Fix it." The attendant's uncertainty shifted into quiet obedience. She turned to the woman. "Ma'am, I'm afraid we'll have to move you to another seat. We can offer a comfortable spot in business class." The woman exhaled slowly, but her face remained composed. "I'm staying in my assigned seat." Richard let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, please, don't make this difficult. You think you can argue your way into staying here? You're lucky we're not calling security." A ripple of quiet murmurs spread through the cabin, but no one intervened. They were watching, though, recording even. Richard noticed a man in row 3 discreetly holding up his phone, capturing the scene. He sneered. "Go ahead, film it. Won't change a damn thing." But the woman wasn't looking at the phone. She was looking at Richard. And for the first time, there was something in her gaze, something sharp, calculated. "All right," she said softly, reaching into her pocket. "If that's how you want to play it." She pulled out her phone and, with a few swift taps, sent a message. One word: proceed. Richard didn't see it, but the moment she put her phone away, she gave him a small, knowing smile. And that smile unsettled him. Richard leaned back in his seat, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips as the flight attendant lingered beside him, clearly uncertain about how to proceed. It amused him how hesitant people became when faced with authority. The woman still hadn't moved, her posture annoyingly composed, her hands resting lightly on her lap. "I don't see why this is a discussion," Richard scoffed, adjusting the platinum cufflinks on his tailored shirt. "Do I need to remind you who I am?" The flight attendant hesitated. Richard Vaughn wasn't just any passenger. He was a powerful CEO, a man whose name carried weight in business circles. But despite the pressure, she glanced at the woman's ticket again, biting her lip. "Sir, she has a valid first-class ticket," she said finally. "I can't." Richard's laugh was short, dismissive. "You can't? Of course you can." He turned to the woman, eyes scanning her with the same scrutiny one might give an insect on fine china. "I know how these things work. You pulled some strings, got a last-minute upgrade. That's the only explanation." The woman exhaled through her nose, tilting her head slightly, as if observing an experiment unfold. "You assume a lot, Mr. Vaughn." He gave her a slow, indulgent smile, the kind reserved for people he didn't consider worth his time. "And I'm usually right." A second flight attendant approached, a young man with sharp features and a name tag that read Daniel. He assessed the tension in the air before speaking. "Is there an issue here?" Richard gestured toward the woman. "She's in the wrong place." Daniel frowned. "I just checked the system. Her name is on the manifest." She doesn't belong," Richard interrupted, voice dropping an octave, his words deliberate. "And I'm sure you don't want to cause a scene, do you?" The young attendant shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward his superior. There was a silent conversation in the flick of their eyes, a question of whether it was worth arguing with a man like Richard Vaughn. "I believe we can find a solution that satisfies everyone," Daniel finally said. "Miss, there's a seat available in business class. We'd be happy to accommodate you there." The woman's lips parted slightly, as if she were tasting the words before responding. Then she simply asked, "And why would I do that?" Richard leaned in, voice smooth as silk. "Because it's the best option available to you." There was no mistaking the implied message. "Be grateful we're even offering you that." Silence stretched between them, thick with expectation. The passengers nearby were no longer pretending not to listen. A woman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, while a man in the row ahead subtly tilted his phone, still recording. The woman sighed, her fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. Then, with the same controlled grace, she retrieved her phone. "Do you really want to go down this road, Mr. Vaughn?" Something about the way she said his name sent a flicker of unease through him. It wasn't fear. No, not that, but an unfamiliar feeling, like standing on the edge of something he didn't quite understand. Richard masked it with a chuckle, shaking his head. "What? You gonna tweet about it? Call your little online army?" She smiled, a quiet, knowing expression. "No," she said. "I don't need to." The simplicity of her answer irritated him more than any argument would have. Daniel glanced between them, uncertain. "Miss, are you refusing the reassignment?" "I am," she replied. "And I suggest you reconsider who you're siding with." The young flight attendant stiffened, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Richard exhaled sharply, losing patience. "Still playing the victim? Fine. I'll make this easy." He pulled out his phone, tapping the screen with quick, practiced movements. "I'll call the airline myself." He looked up, flashing her a grin that was all teeth. "And when I'm done, you won't be sitting anywhere on this plane." Richard Vaughn prided himself on efficiency. Deals were closed with a handshake and a phone call. Problems vanished with a well-placed threat. And people who didn't know their place? He buried them under the weight of his influence. This would be no different. With a flick of his finger, he dialed a direct line, one that most people wouldn't even have access to. The call barely rang twice before it connected. "Brent, it's Richard." A pause. Then a voice, crisp and professional. "Mr. Vaughn, what can I do for you?" Richard leaned back, one arm draped casually over the seat, a smirk curling his lips. "I'm on flight 217, and I've got a situation. There's a passenger in first class who shouldn't be here." The man on the other end hesitated. "You mean an unauthorized boarding?" "No," Richard said, shooting a glance at the woman still seated beside him. "I mean someone who clearly got here by mistake." His voice was light, almost amused, but there was an unmistakable weight behind his words, a message Brent would understand. The flight attendant, Daniel, stood frozen nearby, pretending not to listen. Other passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to watch. The woman, however, remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. Richard thrived in moments like this. The waiting, the anticipation, the knowledge that the power balance was already tipping in his favor. Brent sighed. "Richard, I can't." Richard's smirk didn't waver. "I don't think you're hearing me. I want her off this plane when we land." Another pause. Then quieter. "That might not be possible." Richard's expression darkened slightly. "Excuse me. She's..." "Listen, Richard, I don't think you understand who," Richard scoffed, cutting him off. "I don't care who she is. She's no one." And that was final. He ended the call before Brent could argue, slipping his phone back into his pocket with a satisfied nod. That was taken care of. The woman finally moved, shifting slightly to face him. "That was impressive," she said lightly. Richard tilted his head. "Oh, you think so?" She smiled. "Not in the way you think." Her lack of reaction irritated him. Most people flinched when he wielded his influence like a weapon. But she sat there, completely unfazed. "Tell me," he mused, tapping a finger against the armrest. "What exactly are you trying to prove here?" She exhaled softly, as if mildly entertained by his question. "I don't need to prove anything, Mr. Vaughn." Richard let out a short laugh. "Of course you do. People like you always do." The moment the words left his mouth, he felt the shift in the cabin. It was subtle, shoulders tensing, eyes flicking away. Even Daniel stiffened. Richard didn't care. The woman held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "People like me," she echoed. Her voice was quiet, but something in it made the air feel heavier. Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't play coy. You know exactly what I mean. Always looking for a way in. Always acting like the rules don't apply to you." Still, she didn't react, and that was beginning to unnerve him more than anything else. Daniel cleared his throat, trying to defuse the tension. "Mr. Vaughn, perhaps we should." Richard turned on him sharply. "Unless you're about to tell me you found her another seat, I don't need to hear it." Daniel hesitated. "Sir, Richard's phone buzzed. "A message from Brent. I strongly advise you to stop this now." Richard frowned. That was unexpected. His grip tightened around the device as he reread the words. The woman beside him remained silent, but he swore he saw something flicker in her expression, like she already knew what the message said. Richard shook off the unease creeping into his spine. It didn't matter. He had made the call. The decision had been made, and when they landed, she would regret ever thinking she could sit beside him. Richard's fingers hovered over his phone, rereading Brent's message. "I strongly advise you to stop this now." It wasn't the response he had expected. No reassurance, no confirmation, just a warning, vague and unsettling. His jaw tightened. Brent must have misunderstood. That had to be it. There was no way a simple passenger, one sitting next to him like she belonged, could be worth hesitation. Richard tucked his phone away, exhaling sharply. He was overthinking. This was just corporate politics, someone trying to cover their own ass. He turned to Daniel. "Bring me a drink." The young flight attendant hesitated. His posture screamed discomfort, but he nodded and walked toward the galley. Richard drummed his fingers against the armrest, eyes flicking to the woman beside him. Still composed, still waiting. "You're awfully quiet," he muttered. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying something beneath a microscope. "And you're awfully desperate." Richard's smirk faltered for the briefest second. "Excuse me." She gestured toward his phone, tucked away but not forgotten. That call. The way you're gripping the armrest. You're trying very hard to control a situation that's already slipping away from you. Richard let out a humorless laugh. Oh, you think you've won something here? She leaned back, crossing her legs. I think you assume you can't lose. His expression darkened. Before he could respond, Daniel returned, placing a crystal glass filled with amber liquid on the tray table. Your drink, sir. Richard picked it up, swirling the liquid before taking a slow sip. The woman didn't look at the drink. She looked at him, and for the first time, Richard felt something foreign twist in his chest. She knew something he didn't, and he hated that. Another flight attendant approached, this one older, with a more authoritative stance. She knelt beside the woman's seat, voice low and measured. Ma'am, she said cautiously, if there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable, please let us know. Richard scoffed. Now you're offering special treatment. The woman smiled politely at the attendant. I appreciate the concern, but I'm fine. The attendant nodded, but didn't move immediately. Richard caught the way her fingers twitched slightly, the way her eyes flicked toward him. They were nervous. Not of her, of him. His fingers tightened around his glass. Why don't you go check on someone who actually needs your help? The woman's smile didn't fade. You do seem to be the one struggling here. Richard's patience snapped. That's it. He turned, waving Daniel over again. Tell the captain I want her off this flight the second we land. I don't care how it's handled. Silence. Daniel's throat bobbed. His lips parted, but he hesitated. Sir, I really think you should. You think? Richard snarled. Do I look like I care what you think? I said get it done. Daniel swallowed hard, nodding stiffly before hurrying toward the cockpit. The woman exhaled softly. That was a mistake. Richard turned back to her, brow arching. Oh, and why is that? She reached for her phone again. Another message. This time, he saw the name on the screen. It was the same contact Brent worked under. Richard's stomach clenched. The woman lifted her gaze, her voice calm, almost sympathetic. You really should have checked who you were dealing with. Richard Vaughn never second-guessed himself, never hesitated. But for the first time in years, he felt the ice beneath his feet begin to crack. And he had no idea how deep the water went. Richard Vaughn had spent his life bending the world to his will. Money opened doors. Power kept them open. Influence ensured no one dared to shut them in his face. So why did it feel like the walls were closing in? The woman beside him had barely moved, yet somehow she had shifted the balance of power. Richard could feel it, like an invisible force pressing against his chest. It was absurd. He was Richard Vaughn. He made decisions. He didn't suffer them. He forced a smirk. You act like you won something. The woman exhaled, shaking her head slightly. That's the thing about people like you. You always assume it's a game. Richard chuckled, low and mocking. And you always assume you're more important than you are. She tilted her head. Am I? Before he could respond, Daniel returned, his face pale, his fingers twitching slightly against his notepad. Sir, he started carefully. I spoke with the captain. Richard waved a dismissive hand. Good. Let's get this over with. Daniel hesitated. The captain says we'll discuss the matter after we land. Richard's smirk faltered. After? That wasn't the answer he was expecting. After landing meant it wasn't going his way. His fingers curled into a fist. Did he even hear what I said? Daniel swallowed. Yes, sir. But there have been developments. Something in Richard's gut twisted. Developments. Daniel's eyes flicked, just for a second, to the woman beside him. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but Richard noticed. A slow, cold realization crept into his spine. This wasn't just a delay. This was deliberate. The woman took a sip of water, then glanced at Richard with the same quiet amusement that was beginning to drive him insane. You're awfully quiet, she mused. Richard forced a laugh. Just enjoying the show. She smiled. So am I. The weight of the conversation pressed down on him. The other passengers were watching, some blatantly, some pretending not to. The phone in his pocket felt heavier than it should have. He needed control. Richard turned to Daniel. Fine. If the captain wants to handle this later, then I want an official report filed now. Make it clear that Sir, Daniel interrupted, his voice lower now, strained. I think you should just sit tight. Richard's patience snapped. Sit tight. He let out a sharp laugh. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? Daniel didn't answer. That alone sent a chill down Richard's spine. Because normally, people did answer. They rushed to reassure him, to fix things, to cater to his needs before he could even finish a sentence. But Daniel stood there, quiet, and Richard Vaughn realized, for the first time in his life, that no one was rushing to fix this for him. The woman set her glass down with a soft clink. It's funny, she said. You walked onto this plane assuming you had all the power, that no one could touch you. And yet, here we are. Richard clenched his jaw. Here we are, he echoed, voice tight. She leaned forward slightly. Do you feel it yet? Richard said nothing. She smiled, slow and knowing. That sinking feeling. And that's when it hit him. Richard Vaughn had spent decades shaping reality to his liking. His voice carried weight, his name opened doors, and when he wanted something done, it happened. This time, nothing was happening. The silence around him wasn't submission, it was something worse. Resignation. Daniel had retreated to the galley. The passengers had stopped pretending to mind their own business, and the woman beside him remained as composed as ever. Richard checked his watch. 17 minutes until landing. He exhaled, forcing the tension from his shoulders. This is ridiculous, he muttered, mostly to himself. The woman didn't react. He turned his head slightly, studying her profile. She wasn't fidgeting, wasn't checking her phone every few seconds. If anything, she looked bored. Tell me something, Richard said, his voice lower now. What exactly do you think is going to happen when we land? She glanced at him, unimpressed. You'll find out soon enough. Something in her tone made his pulse tick faster. Richard forced a smirk. You're enjoying this, aren't you? She folded her hands neatly in her lap. I enjoy accountability. Richard scoffed. You mean revenge? She shrugged, but the hint of amusement in her expression made his stomach tighten. He ran a hand down his tie, smoothing out non-existent wrinkles. This situation could still be salvaged. Richard reached for his phone and started drafting an email. He needed a backup plan. If Brent wasn't willing to handle this, he'd find someone who would. The moment his fingers tapped the screen, a shadow loomed over him. It was the older flight attendant, the one who had checked on the woman earlier. She wasn't smiling. Mr. Vaughn, she said evenly, I need to ask you to put your phone away. Richard barely looked up. I'll be quick. No, she said, firmer now. You won't. His head snapped up, annoyance flashing in his eyes. Excuse me. The captain has requested that all passengers remain seated. That includes you. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. The woman beside him watched quietly, waiting. His fingers hovered over the send button, but something in the flight attendant's gaze made him pause. It wasn't the usual deference. There was no sir, I'm just following protocol, or I apologize for the inconvenience. It was finality. Richard exhaled sharply, shoving his phone into his pocket. Fine. The flight attendant lingered for half a second, then nodded and walked away. Richard turned back to the woman, lowering his voice. You think you've won something here? She arched a brow. You keep asking that. Because it didn't make sense. If she was just another passenger, she should have been flustered. If she was some activist looking for attention, she should have been gloating. Instead, she was waiting. Richard clenched his jaw. 11 minutes until landing. The plane began its descent. Outside the window, city lights sparkled in the approaching skyline. His mind raced. There was still a way to turn this around. He just had to figure out what he was up against. Richard Vaughn had built his career on anticipation. He didn't react, he acted. He saw problems before they formed, eliminated obstacles before they became threats. Right now, he was 2 steps behind. The descent was smooth, the runway growing larger beneath them, but the unease in his chest tightened like a vice. Something was waiting for him after landing, and he had no idea what it was. The older flight attendant had disappeared to the front of the cabin. Daniel was nowhere in sight, and the woman beside him still waiting. Richard exhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral. "Tell me something," he said, his voice carefully measured. "If this is supposed to intimidate me, you're going to be disappointed." She turned her head slightly, regarding him with mild interest. "Why would I waste time intimidating someone who's already cornered?" A flicker of irritation sparked beneath his skin. "Cornered? That's rich. You think a few inconveniences mean anything to me?" She hummed softly, as if considering something. "I think the problem isn't the inconvenience. It's that, for once, you don't know what happens next." Richard forced a smirk. "You're enjoying this little game, aren't you?" "Still assuming it's a game." She sighed, shaking her head. The fastened seatbelt sign dinged overhead. The flight attendants moved efficiently, preparing for landing. The woman beside him calmly reached for her bag, adjusting the strap, completely at ease. Richard's jaw tensed. 7 minutes until touchdown. He shifted his focus, scanning the first-class cabin. Some passengers were murmuring quietly, others pretending not to eavesdrop. A man 2 rows ahead was glancing at his phone, checking something. Richard's fingers curled against the armrest. "I don't like being kept in the dark." The woman smiled faintly. "Good. Then maybe you'll remember how this feels." A sharp clang of metal echoed through the cabin as the landing gear deployed. Richard's pulse ticked faster. "Whatever you think you have, it won't hold up," he muttered. "People like you come and go. People like me, people like you," she interrupted, tone casual. "Never think about what happens when the doors finally close." Richard opened his mouth, but before he could respond, a new voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Please remain seated as we approach the gate." The moment the wheels touched the tarmac, his phone vibrated. One new message. He pulled it out, breath hitching slightly, when he saw the sender. "Brent, don't get off the plane. Call me. Now." Richard's grip tightened around the device. The woman beside him smoothly rose to her feet, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "I'd say it's been a pleasure, Mr. Vaughn, but we both know that's a lie." Richard barely heard her. His mind was moving too fast, calculating, searching for the missing piece. What the hell was waiting for him outside? The doors would open soon. The answer was minutes away. And for the first time in his life, Richard Vaughn wasn't sure if he wanted to know. Richard Vaughn had spent his life walking through doors that others couldn't even knock on. Influence, power, control. These weren't aspirations. They were guarantees. So why was he hesitating now? The plane had landed, but the seatbelt sign remained on. The cabin door hadn't opened yet. A quiet tension gripped the air, thick with anticipation. Passengers exchanged glances, hushed whispers floating through first class. Some were still pretending to ignore what was happening. Others weren't bothering anymore. Richard's phone buzzed again. "Brent, do not leave your seat." His fingers curled around the device. That was the third message. No explanations, no instructions. Just don't move. The woman beside him stood gracefully, adjusting the strap of her bag. "You should have listened the first time." Richard finally turned to face her, jaw tightening. "Listen to what?" She exhaled softly, as if she pitied him. "That you weren't the one making the rules this time." The curtain separating first class from the rest of the cabin swept open. 2 men in dark suits stepped in, broad shoulders, crisp ties, the unmistakable air of authority. Richard's stomach twisted. These weren't airline employees. The first man leaned toward the head flight attendant, exchanging quiet words. She nodded stiffly, then turned toward the cabin, clearing her throat. "Mr. Vaughn," she announced, her voice level but firm, "please remain seated." A ripple of unease spread through the passengers. Heads turned. Murmurs grew louder. Richard's heart pounded against his ribs, but his expression remained stone cold. "And if I don't?" One of the suited men finally spoke. "Then we'll have a problem." Silence. Richard's pulse thrummed in his ears. His brain worked at lightning speed, running through possibilities. This wasn't security detaining an unruly passenger. This was something else, something bigger. The woman beside him sighed, then pulled a sleek black wallet from her coat pocket. She flipped it open, flashing an ID that sent a cold shock down his spine. Alexis Carter, Chairwoman and CEO, Orion Aviation Group. The name hit like a freight train. Orion Aviation, the parent company of this airline. His breath caught. His thoughts scrambled for an escape route. Alexis shut the ID holder with a soft snap and met his stunned gaze. "You spent this entire flight trying to have me removed," she murmured. "The irony is I could have removed you before we even took off." The words were a gut punch. Passengers gasped. A few muttered in shock. The energy in the cabin shifted. The people Richard had ignored for hours were now staring at him, some with amusement, others with disbelief, a handful with quiet, grim satisfaction. Richard forced himself to recover, his mind scrambling for damage control. "If this is some kind of power play, this isn't a game, Mr. Vaughn," Alexis interrupted smoothly. One of the suited men stepped forward. "Mr. Vaughn, you are officially barred from all Orion Aviation flights, effective immediately." Richard inhaled sharply. "You can't, actually," Alexis said, her voice light, too light. "I can." She turned slightly, nodding toward the flight crew. "Let's not keep the other passengers waiting." The cabin door unlocked with a mechanical hiss. The suited men flanked Richard's seat. "Time to go." His fingers clenched against the armrest. This wasn't happening, but it was. Alexis Carter stepped into the aisle, smoothing the sleeve of her coat. Before walking past him, she leaned in slightly. "I'd say it was a pleasure flying with you," she murmured, "but I think we both know better." Then, without another glance, she walked off the plane. And Richard Vaughn, for the first time in his life, he had nowhere to go but down. Richard Vaughn had always believed that money could fix anything. Laws could be bent, rules could be rewritten, consequences avoidable. But as he was escorted off the plane, flanked by two men who didn't even pretend to respect him, that belief began to crack. The jet bridge was eerily silent. No greetings from airline staff. No red carpet treatment. Just the rhythmic echo of his own footsteps, a sound that suddenly felt too loud. The two men led him past the waiting area, where passengers were checking departure screens or scrolling mindlessly through their phones. None of them knew who he was. None of them cared. That was the first sign something was wrong. The second came when they didn't take him toward the main terminal. Richard stiffened. "Where exactly are we going?" Neither man answered. His heartbeat kicked up. "I asked you a question." Silence. They veered left, into a corridor marked authorized personnel only. Panic crept into his spine. This wasn't a simple removal. This was something else. Finally, they stopped outside a private lounge. One of the men opened the door, stepping aside. "Go in." Richard hesitated. He wasn't used to being ordered around. But what choice did he have? Squaring his shoulders, he stepped inside. The door shut behind him with a quiet click. The room was sleek, minimalist, glass walls, a conference table, dim overhead lighting. At the far end, a single person sat waiting. Alexis Carter. She was checking her watch, unconcerned, as if he wasn't even worth looking at. Richard exhaled sharply. "If you think I'm going to grovel, groveling would require self-awareness," Alexis interrupted, finally lifting her gaze. "And I doubt you've ever had much of that." He clenched his jaw. "Let's cut the theatrics. What do you want?" She leaned back, folding her arms. "I don't want anything, Mr. Vaughn." "You do." His fingers twitched. "And what's that supposed to mean?" Alexis studied him for a beat, then slid a sleek black folder across the table. He eyed it warily before snatching it up. The first page hit him like a gunshot. Termination of contract. His company's exclusive partnership with Orion Aviation, gone. The second page was worse. A formal notice of lifetime flight ban. Every subsidiary, every affiliate, every luxury flight network connected to Orion Aviation. He felt the blood drain from his face. "You can't." "I can," Alexis said coolly. His grip tightened on the folder. "This is personal." She tilted her head. "You made it personal when you decided that my presence offended you." Richard's pulse pounded in his ears. I can fix this. Alexis chuckled, actually chuckled. That's adorable. You think you're still negotiating. I can offer nothing, she cut in. You have nothing I need. The finality of it sent a fresh wave of rage crashing through him. He had never been dismissed like this before. Never. His nails dug into the folder. This isn't over. Alexis exhaled slowly, shaking her head. You really don't get it, do you? She stood, straightening her coat. It is over. You just haven't accepted it yet. With that, she turned toward the door. Richard shot up from his seat. I'll make sure you regret this. Alexis paused, glancing at him over her shoulder. You already do, she said simply. Then she walked out, leaving him standing there, holding the weight of his own downfall. Richard Vaughn had spent years at the top, untouchable, respected, feared. Now, he was none of those things. By the time he stepped out of the private lounge, the airport had moved on without him. No one was waiting. No security detail, no assistant scrambling to fix his problems. Just an empty hallway and a long walk toward nowhere, his hands clenched into fists. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. His first call was to Brent, straight to voicemail. The second was to his company's legal team. We'll discuss this at the board meeting. No reassurance, no loyalty, just distance. Panic seeped in. He tried another number. A senator's office, someone who owed him favors. The assistant's voice was polite, too polite. Mr. Vaughn, I'm afraid Senator Alden is unavailable at this time. Richard forced a smile. Tell him it's urgent. A long pause. Then, finally, we'll reach out if necessary. The line clicked dead. A tremor ran through his fingers. They were cutting him off. He turned toward the terminal's massive digital screens, searching for flights. The Orion Aviation logo blinked at him from nearly everyone. A painful reminder. Every major airline he depended on was under their control. He wasn't just blacklisted from luxury travel. He was locked out of the entire system. A voice broke through the growing chaos in his mind. You look lost. Richard turned sharply. Alexis Carter stood a few feet away, hands in her coat pockets, watching him with the same quiet amusement she'd worn the entire flight. He swallowed his pride. He had no choice. This is too far, he said, voice low. She arched a brow. Is it? Richard exhaled sharply, lowering his tone. I can fix this. Alexis smiled, shaking her head. That's the problem, Richard. You think consequences are something you can negotiate. His jaw tightened. And you think you're better than me? Her smile faded. No, she said simply. But I knew better than to pick a fight I couldn't win. She let that sink in before adding, you should have known better too. Richard's chest heaved, frustration clawing at his throat. He had spent years making people fear him. Now no one was afraid. Alexis checked her watch. Well, I have a flight to catch. His stomach twisted. She still had the luxury of walking away. She turned to leave, then hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. Oh, and Richard? He swallowed. What? She smiled. Enjoy the economy class experience. And just like that, she was gone. Richard Vaughn stood alone, a king without a kingdom, a man without control. This wasn't just a temporary setback. This wasn't a lesson he could unlearn. This was who he was now. No first-class lounges. No priority treatment. No one left to call. Just another passenger. The end. This is what happens when arrogance meets consequences. Do you think Richard deserved what he got? Let us know in the comments. And tell us, where are you watching from today? If you love stories about power, justice, and karma, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the next one.